We got another one of them. Popping at the mouth or the side of his neck when he pouts. No argument, no rebuttal from. He ain't from my town, I don't know him, so I'm guessing he's a clown.
Welcome to 3 Count Commentaries. Today we're going to be talking about Vice Dark Side of the Ring on Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert from April the 29th, 2025. Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert is an interesting case because I don't know a lot about him. He died in 1995 when I was merely 11 years old. And since he never really made it on a national stage, I didn't really get to see a lot of him. But I did see plenty of him watching old ECW on the WWE network. So it was good to see some footage and different things from other places that he had been, especially since I have not been able to actually sit down and watch a lot of Memphis. So that was good. So I watched the episode and the episode was very solid. It was one pretty big piece missing, and that was Missy Hyatt, who was his first wife. And Missy Hyatt wrote extensively about Eddie in her book, which I skimmed through and will bring some of the passages to you. The episode, I think, was pretty solid and tells the story of Eddie Gilbert's life in a lot of the same way that I read it in various books. I read Mike Mooneyham write articles about him. I read about him in Todd is God, Todd Gordon's book. And I picked up a lot of information and I decided I was going to bring it to you as a way of expanding what we learned in Dark Side of the Ring. So we learned that Eddie Gilbert is third generation. Him and his brother Doug, their father and grandfather, was also a wrestler. Then we see that Eddie started out taking pictures. He was a photographer, big fan of Memphis wrestling, grew up a huge fan of Jerry the King Lawler. And this is good because, of course, there's parallels with Jim Cornette, who was in the episode as well, as he was also a photographer, but in Louisville, Kentucky. So he gets into the business. He's wrestling with his dad. Him and his dad are tag team partners for a little while. Eddie Gilbert does the famous Tupelo concession fight, which pretty much everybody who watches wrestling has seen this tape at one point in time or another. And this, of course, is what inspires Atsushi Onita to create FMW in Japan, which popularized hardcore wrestling in Japan after he was injured and thought that his career might be over. And Onita, of course, he is considered to be the guy who may have inspired Paul Heyman when it comes to ECW and thinking that ECW could be popular on that same level, because at one point in time, FMW was one of the more popular wrestling promotions in the entire country of Japan. Of course, Eddie Gilbert had already introduced hardcore wrestling into ECW. He had introduced it from the very beginning, as he was the original booker. Well, he was the third booker after Todd Gordon and a guy named Larry Winters. But he was the guy who actually created the style and created the structure that Paul Heyman would play in later on. They skipped forward to the 1980s, about 1982, 1983, when Eddie Gilbert had his car accident while wrestling in the WWF. And he broke his neck and damaged his heart. And this car accident actually occurred in May of 1983. If I remember correctly, and this comes from skimming some old observers, he was injured May 10th, 1983. Now this is important because May 11th in Allentown, Pennsylvania, Nancy Argentino was killed. You know, the girlfriend of Superfly Jimmy Snuka. So literally in the same town, the day before, Eddie Gilbert was in a car accident. So Vince McMahon had to deal with 23-year-old Eddie Gilbert almost dying. And a young lady did die in a hotel room. They tell the story that he was treated by Dr. George Sahorian while he was in Philadelphia and may have been prescribing him painkillers. Now, I've tried to look this up. I didn't see a lot about it, but this accident did happen in Pennsylvania, and Dr. George Sahorian was one of the doctors in Pennsylvania, so it's entirely possible. They tell us in Dark Side of the Ring that Eddie Gilbert, being a guy who was not very big and not really interested in what Vince McMahon was trying to do with the WWF, decided he wanted a little bit more realism in his product and decided to leave. And this would become important later because Eddie Gilbert wanted to come back to the WWF in the late 80s, but Vince McMahon was more interested in Missy Hyatt. We'll tell that story in a moment. I'm just trying to be linear here in terms of filling in all the blanks. We learn about Hot Stuff Eddie Gilbert, him taking the name from the Donna Summer song, which is very cool. I don't know why they didn't mention that, but that's where he got it from. He would go on to become a booker in Mid-South in the Watts territory. Now, this is important because a substantial amount of his story involving Missy Hyatt involves Mid-South wrestling. So, technically speaking, according to Missy Hyatt, Eddie Gilbert was actually kind of a co-booker with Ken Mantell, who was the booker of the territory. And she was with a guy named Hollywood John Tatum. Some people know him, some people don't. Anyway, he's a wrestler. She cheated on Hollywood John Tatum with Eddie Gilbert. And then he was booked into an angle with the two of them. Think Edge, Lita, and Matt Hardy. Except it's 1980s Texas and Oklahoma. According to Missy Hyatt, she got called to Vince McMahon's office in Stamford. And she took the call and she took Eddie with her. And Eddie was excited about the opportunity. He wanted to rejoin the WWF, but was disappointed that Vince McMahon was more interested in Missy Hyatt. Apparently, this was around the time Roddy Piper was about to retire, and he wanted to replace Roddy Piper doing a Piper's Pit style segment. Missy Hyatt ended up getting the job. It was called Missy's Manor. At this point in time, Eddie Gilbert was basically hired similar to Mark Merrow, as Vince just wanted Missy, but he kept Eddie Gilbert around. Eddie Gilbert wasn't interested in just being kept around. He decided to go back to Texas and do booking while Missy floundered in the WWF. She didn't like the character that she had to play. She wasn't comfortable doing the Missy's Manor stuff. But most of all, according to her, she just missed her husband. So she left the WWF after 2 months because she missed being with Eddie Gilbert. Unfortunately, it wouldn't be all sunshine and rainbows. In the book, she would admit to having an affair with Dr. Tom Pritchard, who of course is the brother of Bruce Pritchard. She had an affair with him, apparently in retaliation to Eddie Gilbert having affairs in different towns that she didn't appear in or something to that effect. She had no proof that he cheated. She just kind of had a woman's intuition. Apparently, her and Dr. Tom Pritchard, she didn't go into really painstaking detail, but apparently the two of them had sex in a car, and this was viewed by some passerbys, and it spread around that she was sleeping around on Eddie Gilbert, and he became a laughingstock. According to her, a lot of people found out about this affair, and she had embarrassed him, and he had lost a lot of respect in front of the boys because of her behavior. In any event, he was still pretty well liked, and he was the booker of the Mid-South, now called UWF territory, which was owned by Bill Watts. When Bill Watts decided to sell his promotion to Jim Crockett, then there became a big seismic shift in the pro wrestling business, because now Vince McMahon is buying up a bunch of territories and Jim Crockett is buying up a bunch of territories. And the Texas, Mississippi, Oklahoma territory, Louisiana territory is purchased by Jim Crockett and folded into what they call the NWA. Even though the NWA was never one promotion, it became essentially one promotion at this time, as Jim Crockett was the biggest promoter in the NWA and had all the control and all the power over the championship. Now, for Eddie Gilbert, however, this would be a complete and utter change. He was working kind of as an assistant to Ken Mantell for a long time, and then he became sort of the booker in UWF. But once the company was bought, Dusty Rhodes was the booker for Jim Crockett Promotions, and now he's got to have all of his ideas approved by Dusty. Now, according to Missy Hyatt, he didn't like this, and that he was very frustrated because he thought Dusty actually showed favoritism towards their own guys. Basically, the Jim Crockett guys got better spots, better opportunities. They always won when there was a head-to-head competition between the UWF and the NWA. He didn't like that sort of favoritism. And according to Missy Hyatt, he explained that him and Dusty had different ideas of how to book. That Dusty was really traditional, very old school, black hats and white hats, good guys and bad guys, while Eddie Gilbert was more of the blurred lines, shades of gray kind of storyteller. And so he left and went to the Continental Wrestling Federation in Alabama. Once Ted Turner bought WCW, Eddie Gilbert actually returned to WCW, which of course was formerly the NWA, which was formerly Jim Crockett Promotions. During this time, according to Missy Hyatt, Eddie Gilbert became very frustrated with Kevin Sullivan, who was one of the bookers in WCW. He felt that Kevin Sullivan was sabotaging his ideas. She claims that she was able to confirm this later, that people like Kevin Sullivan didn't really like Eddie Gilbert, and they probably just didn't respect him, and that people talked a lot about him behind his back. He got very stressed out around this time. He also, of course, would be later fired by Ric Flair from WCW, which they talked about in Dark Side of the Ring, because he refused to do a job for Ron Simmons. So he was incredibly frustrated in WCW and decided to leave. But when he left WCW, he also left Missy Hyatt. This was in 1989. And apparently he was gone for over a month, and she thought he was never coming back. So she started dating a guy named Bill Frolic, who apparently is a friend of Buff Bagwell. When one day she woke up and Eddie Graham was in the house while her and Bill Frolic were in bed. Apparently this, of course, caused some kind of huge scene, which then kind of died down as Eddie Gilbert pretty much said, hey, I left. You know, she just wanted him to sign the divorce papers. So once they were signed, he was gone. Now, this is interesting because in the book, she talks about how he chased Bill Frolic at first, and then they talked, they shook hands, and then that was the end of it. Interestingly enough, this is the exact same thing that Hollywood John Tatum would discuss in a shoot interview he did, I think, with Hannibal TV, where he talked about, hey, you know, Eddie Gilbert's having sex with my girlfriend. And then he came to me, we talked it out, and I shook his hand, and then that was it. She went with him. And I was like, wow, that's very interesting. It's actually kind of surprising that he would, you know, it's the old adage, you know, you lose them how you get them, kind of. And it seems like he had the same mentality. Like John Tatum explained it, like it was almost like a handoff. Like, I'm handing her off to you, you know, and now he's handing her off to this Bill Frolic guy. So after this, he went back to Memphis, where he worked in the USWA. This where he does the infamous angle with Jerry the King Lawler, where they ran him over with a car, and he got chased by a fan with a knife. A whole lot of stuff going on down there in Memphis. For the purposes of timeline, we're around 1991, 1992. Because around this time, he starts going to work for an upstart by the name of Todd Gordon. Todd Gordon is taking over the Philadelphia territory after Joe Goodhart stole a bunch of money and ran. So now Todd Gordon is left trying to book the Northeast Philadelphia territory by himself. At first, there was a guy that Todd Gordon hired by the name of Larry Winters. Larry Winters literally booked one show, was fired, and then Todd Gordon took over as booker from there. In March of 1993, according to Todd Gordon, that's when he hired Eddie Gilbert to be the booker. He promised him $1,000 a week to be the booker because he wanted the Memphis product, you know, the blood and guts, fire sort of booking. At this point in time, he brings in Paul Heyman. Now, Paul Heyman was a young man in the early 80s when Eddie Gilbert worked in the WWF, and Heyman was a photographer at this point in time and floating around backstage in the WWF. So they knew each other for a long time, and now Heyman is in the business. He's a manager, and Eddie Gilbert needs sort of an assistant to help him around ECW. In July of 1993, According to Dave Meltzer, Eddie Gilbert bought 49% of ECW from Todd Gordon. Now, I've never seen this anywhere. I've never heard Todd Gordon say this. I never heard Paul Heyman say this. I never heard anyone say that Eddie Gilbert owned 49% of ECW. I've never seen that anywhere else. So take it for what it's worth that Eddie Gilbert was sort of a part owner, a minority owner of ECW. This would have been in July of 93. If that's true, then he was booking, wrestling, and was co-owner of ECW for a spell. He's wrestling there and rebuilding a lot of his reputation. He's working with Cactus Jack. He's working with Terry Funk. They're doing the blood and the guts and the fire. It's, Todd Gordon admitted that it was Eddie Gilbert's connections to the dirt sheets that get ECW some play, and the Torch, and then the Observer, and now the Hardcores are actually for the tapes, and there's tape traders that are interested in ECW, and basically he's Mr. Everything when it comes to ECW at this point in time. Then we get to September of 1993, and the wheels start to come off. Eddie Gilbert is having problems with drugs, and he's becoming unreliable. Todd Gordon says that he's becoming late with editing the television show. He's late writing the television show. He might not even show up to the shows sometimes. Despite this, Todd Gordon wanted to keep Eddie Gilbert around. Eddie Gilbert came to Todd Gordon and said that Jim Crockett was going to start a new wrestling network. Now, this is an important piece because Paul Heyman is working with Eddie Gilbert and Todd Gordon sort of in a position to learn, because the idea is that Paul Heyman is going to be the booker for the Jim Crockett wrestling network that is going to be launched at some point in time. So that's why Paul Heyman was basically floating around. He's basically following Eddie Gilbert to learn what to do. At this point in time, he being Eddie Gilbert, goes to Todd Gordon and says, hey, Jim Crockett wants to hire me. He wants to pay me $1,500 per week, while you're only paying me $1,000. Todd Gordon says, well, good luck. I can't afford to pay you $1,500 a week. Just can't do it. But he wanted to keep him around, so he offered him $1,250. And Eddie Gilbert happily took that in order to stick around. Todd Gordon found out later that Jim Crockett had not offered Eddie Gilbert anything. He just wanted a raise, and he gave him the raise anyway. Despite this, Eddie Gilbert became increasingly more paranoid, and his behavioral issues get out of control. He starts to suspect that Todd Gordon and Paul Heyman are conspiring against him. Todd Gordon and Paul Heyman are having long conversations on the phone. They're laughing and joking amongst each other. And Eddie Gilbert is seeing this sort of out of the side of his eye. Like, why are these two guys all of a sudden so friendly when they didn't know each other until he introduced them? So it goes from that to now all of a sudden Jim Crockett is involved. And Eddie Gilbert thinks that all three of these men are Jews that are conspiring against him. It turns out only two of the three of them are Jews. Only Heyman and Todd Gordon are Jews. Jim Crockett is not a Jew. Todd Gordon is trying to tell Eddie Gilbert that Jim Crockett is not a Jew, but he doesn't want to hear it. In his mind, all the Jews are conspiring against him, and he's trying to figure out why. Now, one of the reasons why he might think that is Heyman never actually left. Heyman was supposed to leave and go join Jim Crockett in the Carolinas to work on Jim Crockett's new project. But Jim Crockett's new project was not going to happen. And so Heyman ended up staying in Philadelphia and becoming friendly with Todd Gordon and created this whole mess in the first place. So because Eddie Gilbert believes that Todd Gordon is working with Jim Crockett to conspire against him, he quits ECW in September of 1993, shortly before the Ultra Class show. When Eddie Gilbert had quit the Ultra Class show, he had pretty much booked the television for that show and then 5 shows afterwards. But he did not book the main event. There was no finish for the main event. He basically left Todd Gordon with the issue of the politics of all of the guys in the main events. Nobody wanted to take a pin because they didn't want to jeopardize their money in Japan. So because Todd Gordon figured, hey, I can't do this, he decides to hire a new booker. And he brings in Kevin Sullivan. So Kevin Sullivan is going to replace Eddie Gilbert. When Eddie Gilbert, his mind clears up and he decides to come back a few days later, he finds out that he's been replaced by Kevin Sullivan, who he hates because of his experience in WCW. He decided, I don't want anything to do with this, but can at least say goodbye to the audience. Paul Heyman doesn't know anything about this. It's been cleared with Todd Gordon, but Paul Heyman doesn't know. At this point, at the end of the main event of Ultra Clash, here comes Eddie Gilbert to say goodbye to the Philadelphia audience. Think of it similar to the curtain call in Madison Square Garden from the Click. And Paul Heyman is livid that Eddie Gilbert would go out there and do that and try to make the show about himself. The two of them get into a shouting match backstage, and that's pretty much it. You do have clips in Dark Side of the Ring of Paul Heyman saying that Eddie Gilbert was like a mentor to him, and then Eddie Gilbert does not have kind things to say about Paul, which, most people did not at the time, but it essentially ended their friendship, and that's very unfortunate. Dave Meltzer, of course, would say that Eddie Gilbert was, quote, dumped as Booker in August of 1993. This would be contested by Ty Gordon, who claims that Eddie Gilbert actually quit 6 days before Ultra Clash. Ultra Clash aired September 18th, so that means Eddie Gilbert quit September the 12th, 1993. Ty Gordon tells the dirt sheets that the split was amicable, which of course is not true because Gilbert quit, then tried to get his job back, then found out he had been replaced, and then replaced with somebody he didn't like, and then found out that Paul was going to take his job, and then he got into an argument with Paul, and it was far from amicable. But that's what Ty Gordon told the dirt sheets in September of 93. The ECW run was the last major thing that Eddie Gilbert did in his life. Of course, he passed away in 1995. In Dark Side of the Ring, they actually showed that he was one of the first guys to do a shoot interview in 1994 in a hotel room, which was pretty cool. I'm not necessarily a big fan of shoot interviews personally, but it just goes to show how ahead of the curve this guy was. Also, they talked to Medusa, who was his second wife. He ended up leaving her too, but that marriage seemed to have been worked out a lot better, but the drug problems, of course, changed his behavior over time, and he just became a complete and totally different person. She reads from one of the letters that he sent, because apparently she kept it, despite the fact that she's been married to another man now for over a decade, well over a decade. I kind of question the morality of keeping your ex-husband's love letters tucked away in a briefcase or something while you're married to somebody else. I don't know if I would like that if I was married to somebody who kept their ex-husband's love letters laying around. But it was a very sweet moment, and it was very nice for Dark Side of the Ring to be able to capture that moment and share with the audience what they were able to experience, and I thought that was a very sweet moment. Of course, Eddie Gilbert passes away in Puerto Rico. He was 33 years old. The official cause of death was a heart attack. There's some debate about whether drugs were involved. His family, of course, denies that drugs were involved, even though he was a known drug abuser. The family claims that the heart was damaged in the 1983 car crash, and he'd been wrestling with an injured heart for 12 years. It was believable. I'm more inclined to believe that once I really put some thought into it. But when a guy's only 33 years old and he conks out like he just fell asleep, then you realize, man, this guy was a hardcore drug abuser for years and years, and that was something that he was pretty well known for. It does bring into question the fact that his heart would just give out 12 years after a heart attack. But then again, the human body is a very weird machine, and bad things happen. This was a very good episode of Dark Side of the Ring, basically because I didn't know a lot about Eddie Gilbert, and he was not a guy that was on my radar for most of the time. So I enjoyed going out there and learning something about him and seeing his story. But let me know what you guys think. Like, share, subscribe. I'll talk to you guys later. Peace out.
Old non-aggression. Once that lesson sets in, you'll see a session. But you got an affection for no progression, regression.